Welcome to Gen Z Hoops, the Gen Z basketball, coaching, and sports business show.
What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Gen Z Hoops podcast. Today, I'm joined by award-winning writer and NBA journalist, Katie Heindl. Katie, how you doing today, ma'am?
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for having me. I'm
Oh, no.
excited.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity today. So before we get into our little conversation here about your career, can you talk a little bit about your connection to the game of basketball?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a funny question because it seems very simple on the surface, but I feel like everybody you ask probably has a different story or maybe like when it clicked for them. But I think for me, my connection probably grew the strongest when the Raptors came to Toronto. So I voted in this contest that like the local newspaper had to name the team. Like when it was announced that there was going to be two expansion teams, they were going to be in Canada, the local paper ran like a poll. And I mean, some of the names, there's like Toronto Tarantulas, there was like Toronto T-Rexes, Terriers was another one. And Jurassic Park had just come out. And I was, a really young kid obsessed with Jurassic Park. So of course I voted for the Raptors. So I think like I'd always liked basketball before that. I really liked like the Detroit kind of bad boys era. I was a big Dennis Rodman fan, I think, just for like his kind of larger than life personality. But there was something about fandom being able to exist in the same city where I lived, and I didn't really have to like adopt these other teams. But probably from then on, the Raptors definitely started it. And, it's grown a lot through my work now to be more league wide and like, extending beyond the league kind of on a global scale. But I'd say that's probably where it started.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. I wish I can like relate to that. I have like the historic franchise of the New York Knicks right in my like backyard over here. So like when I was growing up, it was like that whole like Lynn Sanity era with Jeremy
Yes.
Lin, and then
Yeah.
of course Carmelo Anthony on the wall there. He was like a really big like aspect of like how I like got into the game and stuff like that. I actually recall like one of my classmates, I believe in like second grade, he was like the ball boy for like the Lynn Sanity game against Kobe Bryant,
Oh,
and then he
man.
came in with like this huge like poster of Lynn doing like a layup, and I was like, at that moment, I was like, okay, let me like start researching. But yeah, that's kind of like how I got into the game right there. So like, aside from basketball, you mentioned Dennis Rodman. Was there ever like a player that who like you resonated with, like other than Dennis Rodman?
Like when I was younger, I'd
Yeah,
say I always kind of, and I think this is still true for me for like whether it's like a young like draft prospect or kind of like more role players in the league, I always root for the underdog. I think that's why, for me the Raptors were such, yeah, they were my hometown team, but they were so enticing for so long because they were such an underdog, like DeMar DeRozan, Kyle Lowry, like that whole era was just like trying to go up against these titans and like first like unfortunately Paul Pierce and then like LeBron James and the Cavs,
right.
and just try to make a run at it until something stuck. But I think before that, Rasheed Wallace is definitely someone who
Wow.
stands out. I think that whole era, I am also like kind of at my secret heart, I'm a Pistons fan. Um, so I think Detroit has really embodied that underdog spirit a little too much now. Like they're taking it a little too literally.
Right.
I want them to be good again, but yeah, I think that Rasheed Wallace, kind of Ben Wallace team, I guess like the Malice of the Palace kind of team, but I really loved that team, and I love Rasheed when he played for the Trailblazers. I think the Jailblazers nickname was really stupid and like not deserved. I get why people liked it. It's very catchy. But yeah, I've always rooted for kind of this underdog, sort of scrappy, maybe misunderstood kind of athlete.
Oh yeah. I totally agree. Like Jimmy Butler, he's actually like my favorite player in the NBA
Oh
right.
yeah,
So like
Jimmy's awesome.
my whole family, they're all like Miami Heat fans. So I'm like a Heat fan as well. So like I kind of resonate with the team as well because it's like kind of like I'm not really like the go-to guy on like my team or anything like that. So it's kind of like have to get things out the mud. So I kind of resonate with them on that level. But that leads us into our next point. When did you know that you wanted to get into sports writing?
Yeah, another like should be simple question, but doesn't feel that way. I'd always written. I'd always had like full time other day jobs. I've worked across a lot of different industries. Whether I think we're going to touch on that, but whether it was like media, publishing, not for profits, the arts, and then I always wrote on the side and kind of made it a point to write that. But I was writing more about like culture, the arts, politics. And granted, like I was still a huge basketball fan, but I think I felt a bit of a trepidation to writing about it, maybe because of some preconceived notions of you have to have X amount of experience under your belt, right? Or expertise in order to write about basketball or sports writing. And I also think, coming at it as a woman, there's certainly this preconception. It's like a very male dominated space still. Right. It's changing, but it's, that's still kind of the reality of you had to know twice as much. Like I remember in like some of the first stories that I wrote, they were just like blogs about the Raptors for like a Raptors team site. I would be like quadruple checking my stats, just like the simplest stats. Cause it's like, God forbid I get some of this wrong. Someone's going to call me on it. Probably just like a dude in the comments.
Right.
It's a good lesson, like never read the comments, but like, I was definitely aware of that at first, but I think once I got that out of my head and realized like, wait a second, sports writers, for the most part, they definitely have more access, but you're also writing about sports and especially if you're really passionate about it, whether you're podcasting, writing, you're coming at it from a way where it's like, it's just how you talk about it with your friends, it's how you perceive the game. And I think that's why like more voices are useful than less, and why it's also better to not just emulate the people that came before you. And once I got comfortable with that in my own voice, and I kind of realized there was a bit of a gap in terms of the writing I do about basketball and what was already out there, I think that served me really well. And then, so I started doing it just sort of part-time, and I made the full-time jump. I couldn't have known the timing, but it was just before the pandemic. But I made the full-time jump because I had a feature writing position with the Raptors.
Right.
And I had another writer in residence position in Toronto, not sports related. But between those two things, I thought, like maybe I can finally make the jump to full-time freelance and try and really make a go of this. Because before that, it always just felt like, especially as a freelancer, you're always kind of building up your connections, your network, like all the different places that you write for, and trying to cobble them all together to make a living of it. But I found once I started to do it full time, I basically realized like, what was I waiting for so long to do this?
Oh yeah, of course. Funny thing you actually brought up in your answer just now about like talking about sports with friends and stuff like that. From my perspective, like I actually like for my English class, I actually would write about like sports teams and like famous athletes who like are really important to me. And like my friends and I would like kind of like have these like first take type debates like at like the lunch table and stuff like that. I actually found it like it kind of helped me because I got to see like other different perspectives of like something that I felt so strongly about. Did that ever like occur to you in your experience?
Arguing with people, I think like
Yeah.
when you're first starting, it's kind of like the most formative way to figure out what your opinion is and how it differs, from, again, as I said before, like what else is already out there to a degree. I think sometimes, I think you bring up a good point, and like you're maybe like first takeifying it, and then you kind of get away from that and you realize, okay, but here's what I really think, and this is not just me mimicking like a talking head or a pundit that I follow. But I think for me, a lot of the work that I do now is still based in criticism and kind of looking at the NBA, WNBA, basketball as this mechanism at large with a critical eye. I write a lot about social causes, cultural causes, like things that the NBA overlaps with that I think don't necessarily get covered as much. And to approach something critically doesn't mean that it's negative. It just means you've maybe noticed a gap, or you wonder like, why aren't people, talking about this sort of thing? And I think it's really good to sharpen that skill. And to your point, I think some of the best way to do that at first is to argue with your friends, because it's also so low stakes, right? But
Exactly.
they put the pressure on you because they're like, well, prove what you're saying. So you have to prove what you're saying. But like nothing bad is going to happen if you can't quite prove your argument, but it is a really good way to start.
What I find like really amazing about like all these different talk shows and like especially journalists as a whole, like how much like media attention the WNBA is getting now. I actually had last week I had a guest Taj McWilliams Franklin. She's a women's basketball Hall of Famer, and me and her got dove in like the conversation about like the WNBA brand and how much it's grown. Like what do you think about that? Like how much the brand has grown like over like the last couple of years.
I mean, of course, I think it's well deserved, and I do have to give due credit for like all the people that were covering the WNBA full time, and also like all the WNBA athletes who've like worked for so long and so hard to try and shine a light on the league. Because I think what you're seeing now with how quickly interest, it appears like interest has picked up quickly out of nowhere, but
Right.
things only happen like that when something is really ready. I
Yep.
don't want to call it a product because I think that's like cheapening it, but you know, to a degree, it's like this whole universe was ready for all the eyeballs that are on it now because it was like a fully intact space, phenomenal athletes, like incredible competition, you know, really like riveting storylines, all the things that a sports fan would want to follow. So I think that slow build over time helped to really establish that foundation. I think it's super cool because, you know, one, as a fan, it's twice as much basketball to watch. As a writer and someone who, you know, makes a living writing commentary about these things, it's also great. Toronto is going to be getting a team in a couple of years, which
Oh,
is
wow.
also really exciting. So I think like this sort of snowball effect will speed up. It's been really interesting to me to see almost like the immediate growing pains that have come, you know, with the WNBA and like new fans approaching it, maybe new fans who didn't understand the physicality that was already there in the game. That's
Yep.
been a really funny thing for me to watch, of just like mostly dude fans, I feel like, being like, oh, like they gotta go easier on each other, like, you know,
Yeah.
they shouldn't, being kind of protective about young athletes, where it's like you would never do this with an NBA player, you know what I
Right.
mean? Like a certain amount of physicality is expected, and to the point where like you don't even notice anymore. So it's the same in the I think it's been interesting to pick out these sort of sticking points as fans gradually acclimatize to the fact that the W has a lot more parallels with the NBA than I think new fans realized, just in
Yeah, of
terms of
course.
gameplay. But yeah, overall, I think it's really exciting. It's going to be good for like fans everywhere. And I think, you know, I think people maybe feel a bit like, oh, maybe I'm late to this. Like, I don't know if I can become a fan now, but you can kind of pick it up anywhere.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. Of course, to like the naked eye, a lot of people say like, "Oh yeah, the WNBA, they're not as athletic as NBA players." Of course, there's not going to be like a LeBron James out there like skyrocketing down the lane and dunking. But like the brand of basketball they play, it's like kind of like college-esque in a way. Like so much, a lot of like 5-out spacing, passing cut offense. Like it's cleaner basketball if you think about it as well than like just like the NBA. How it's like kind of entertainment. I view it as like a lot of ISO ball as well.
Mm.
But the
Mm.
WNBA, I also feel like especially this year, like there was so much hype in this around that draft class that came in with like Angel Reese, Caitlin Clark. And we really don't know like outside of like of course like there's those like guys at the combine and stuff like that, but there's not as much like media hype on like the NBA draft I feel like today, other than like Bronny James.
Hmm.
At WNBA draft, I feel like you had like all these like different types of prospects coming out, and now they have all these storylines going forward and all these new rivalries to like make the season way more like kind of compelling in a way.
I
So I,
think it's no, I think that's a really good point. I think the game is a bit more nuanced just because, you know, the athletes play a different way. So the
yeah,
style and skill is going to develop in a different way. I think expansion is also going to help with that because, like, you're going to have more teams. So you'll have more athletes because the W is small, right? There's only
right.
144 players. So expansion always kind of adds to competition because you're going to have even more elite athletes that make teams, and then players are going to have to adjust, right? It's like, think of the NBA when Steph Curry started shooting threes. Like
Yeah,
everyone had to adjust, like every single team. And you know, we do joke like the NBA is a copycat league, but it's that way for a reason because
yeah.
you kind of have to adapt or perish, right? And so I think like in the next few years, I'm really excited to see sort of those side effects or like trickle down effects that expansion is going to have on the W.
Yeah, of course. I totally agree. Well, talking about like your previous experiences as well. You worked for Vice Media for 5 years from 2009 to 2014. In that experience, you were an office manager, an editor, communications, and event manager. Can you talk a little bit about like your experience working with Vice Media over the course of the 5 years and how this experience helped you move forward in your career?
It's crazy that it was only 5 years because in my mind that felt like a 10 year, like a decade. So I started at Vice as an intern actually. I had just come back to Toronto from school in Halifax and in Montreal. And I had just intended to intern there for the summer. I also should say that when I worked in the Vice Toronto office, there were 5 of us. Like it was a
Wow.
very small company. So I think when I left, there was maybe over 200 people that worked there, but like it was tiny. Like I remember shelving magazines in this unfinished dirt floor basement as part of my like internship duties. But I think for me, at that point, I wasn't necessarily clear on what it was I wanted to do. But being in a shop like that where at that time too, Vice was very much sort of a Wild West. It was kind of like if you had an idea and wanted to do something, you could just do it, which was a cool experience. And you don't usually get that in a lot of sort of first time like jobs, really, which that definitely was for me, kind of like my first quote real job. And I think also, going through all of those different roles. At first, it was just like, okay, how do I like working here? How do I not be an intern anymore? I think now companies at least are paying interns, but they definitely weren't then. So I was working like in kind of the service industry as well on the side and balancing my time as an intern just to be able to afford to live. But I think like being an office manager, then deciding like, oh, I like events and I like event marketing, and like all the way to when I left, being the event director across Canada and then with overlap in the North American market. This was like booking like Pusha T and like huge bands to play festivals in Toronto or like across the country. Like that was really fun and always felt selfish because it's like, oh, I can just book the artists and musicians that I like. Sure. Like that felt in some ways like not like a real job, but I think it's learning to balance what you're passionate about and what makes work feel worthwhile, also with the fact of like, is this pointing me in the direction of where I want to go next? And when I left Vice, I was pretty burnt out, and I actually made the jump to a completely different industry. I went and worked in publishing for a little while because I felt like the media space is tough. It's like you work long hours, you're not getting paid that well, you're sort of doing it just because there's a bit of cachet to it and it's fun. But I was getting a bit older and was like, yeah, but like fun only really gets you so far. So I try and remind myself of that in the work I do now, which I do find really fun. And I'm my own boss, but I'm always sort of like, well, what's this thing I'm doing leading to? Like, is this helping me kind of forge a pathway forward? And I think that was probably my biggest takeaway from that time is I probably should have been more aggressive about asking for the things I wanted to do if I stayed there. But overall, good experience, like pretty good sort of first job. Got to be in an industry that I would say is now very changed, if not kind of collapsing and regrowing. I don't even know. Vice is like bankrupt, but it's still around. So I am unclear on what's happening there. But it's cool to be a part of something as it's changing and to shape, almost help like to shape the future. I don't know how many more opportunities I'll have like that professionally.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, like you have to start from somewhere at some point. Like, you know what I mean? I feel like that's really amazing that you were able to like take the time there and like kind of learn the ropes and that like helped you propel yourself to where you are now.
Yeah, I think for me, I always like I get this question a lot, especially for people who want to get into the sports, whether it's sports writing, sports broadcasting, just like sports media in general, is like, well, I didn't go to school for this, or like I didn't, maybe I'm coming at this a little bit, what they think is a little bit later, and like there's no point that's too late, really, if you have the drive to want to do it. And I think for me, having such a varied professional background before I got into sports writing probably helped me a lot. It like the easiest thing I can think of is in interviewing people and being able to have real conversations with people that feel more conversational and comfortable than just like asking sort of point blank questions, which is really helpful when interviewing athletes who oftentimes get the same question over and over and over again.
Right.
But I think I've brought parts of every job I've ever had into the work I do now. I think it's like helped inform my writing a lot more. So I would say like, don't ever look at what you're doing as something that's taking away from what you want to do. It's serving it in some way. It might not just be clear in the moment, but at some point it'll make sense.
Right, most definitely. That leads us into our next point, actually. So, in 2020, as you stated before, you became a feature writer for the Toronto Raptors. Can you talk a little bit about this experience and what was it like to cover the Raptors when they were like coming off that big championship win 2019?
It was cool. I would say that like unfortunately I didn't get to be around the team in the championship season, but I have colleagues that were, and talking to them about it. It was obviously considered a once in a lifetime. I don't want to say once in a lifetime because you're always like they'll win again, but like who knows,
Right.
but it was like a really unique experience. But being around them that next season until COVID sort of ground everything to a halt, I've never felt such palpable energy around a team. And it was very cool. It was like everyone was in such high spirits. The team was more, other than Kawhi, Like the team was more or less intact. And I think there was maybe this thought from outside of the franchise that was going to really drastically change the chemistry and sort of like the team dynamics on and off the floor. But it didn't really at all. Like it almost felt like the team hadn't lost a step.
Right.
They were playing really well. They had that crazy, I think it was like they came back from 30.
Oh, against the Mavs.
Yeah.
Was
And I
it?
was at the game that night and I remember being like, this is like, I've been to playoff games, but that felt almost way more electric and hopeful than even a playoff game, which can feel so tense, right? But that was
Right.
like a game in, I don't know, like December or January or something. So it's like, there's not really crazy stakes, but it felt like you could feel this momentum building. But I'd say that was sort of the high point until everything fell apart. You know, it was kind of like this nice high watermark where everybody was really happy. They'd like accomplished kind of the biggest thing in their careers.
Right.
They didn't necessarily have something to prove, but they still did want to prove something. And I don't know, maybe this is like a bit naive of me, but I do feel like if the pandemic had not happened, they would have had a pretty good chance of repeating, if not going pretty far into the playoffs.
Right.
But it was cool. It was also like, it was fun to go. Like one of the last things I did was go with the team to Chicago for All-Star.
Wow.
And that was my first All-Star weekend. And that was really fun too. Just like All-Star weekend is chaotic, like in the best possible way. But it was fun to like be around that team. And I think it was Pascal Siakam's first All-Star, and to be around Pascal experiencing that for the first time was pretty cool.
What I think the greatest thing about that 2020 season was in point of view of the Toronto Raptors, like they lose a guy like Kawhi Leonard, right? He was shooting like over 50% from the field in those playoffs. But then you see guys like Anunoby, guys Pascal Siakam kind of take that leadership of the team, and Kyle Lowry still like playing at an all-star level. It kind of shows like reminded like the whole basketball world in a way that like, hey, we're still here. We can still play without Kawhi. And I think they finished like the third seed, I believe, in the Eastern Conference that year, and like took Boston all the way to a game 7 in the bubble.
In the bubble, yeah. That was tough because I also will say that was that was probably the best All-Star game in recent memory because Kyle was taking charges.
Yeah.
And it was like really pissing off LeBron and James Harden.
Yeah.
Like they were actually getting angry at him because it's like, don't you know this is an All-Star game? But Kyle's gonna be Kyle. But I will say that watching them in the bubble was kind of tough just because of, I don't know if people know this, but like the restrictions in Canada lasted a lot longer than they did in the States. So Pascal Siakam, I think by the time he got to Orlando, like the team was trying really hard and was sending like weights and equipment to these guys' apartments, but gyms were closed. Like you couldn't even just go to a private gym and work out. They couldn't use the training facilities. So Pascal hadn't really touched a basketball
That's insane.
in months. So like his conditioning, was like nowhere near what it needed to be. So it makes sense to me why, and it's even more impressive that they were able to go so far against Boston, which was like almost it was like Boston's perfect matchup and Toronto's worst matchup. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I remember from that matchup, actually, that they were like down 2-0, I remember. And then, what do you call it? Lowry throws like a Hail
that
Mary
rainbow
pass.
shot. Yeah.
over Taco Fall, hit
Yes.
Anunoby, threw it up. I'll never forget that. That was one of like my favorite moments of the bubble. I can't even lie.
Yeah. No, that was a crazy to watch that. That was an amazing shot.
Yeah, most definitely. So your writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Rolling Stones, Dime Magazine, Slam Magazine, The Athletic, The Flagrant, and Yahoo Sports, among many others. So when you reflect on having your work featured on these platforms, what comes to mind?
It's a good, this is going to sound silly, but like what comes to mind is I'm like, oh, I got to get some more names on there. I think for me, like I've been pretty privileged to work with some amazing editors and obviously write for some really great places and have found like a good home for a lot of those stories. And I also think of all the athletes I was able to talk to for most of those stories, because most of those were profiles or interviews and, involved some pretty in-depth reporting. I also think of the time that went into all of those things, which I feel like sometimes as a writer, once you're done a big project, you put it out of your brain. Like you can't think about it anymore in terms of like, this took me X amount of hours, total. But generally I just like, I have a really hard time celebrating kind of like goals, and every time I will file something at like a new outlet, I'll kind of be like on to the next thing. I'm trying to get better at that. So yeah, I think you've inspired me when I think back on like all the places that I've written for to just like take a minute and like feel proud of that.
Yeah. Do you have like a success motto kind of when you like accomplish something good, you like say it to yourself and it kind of like motivates you to move on to the next thing?
No, I should though. I think there's just always a satisfaction for me in when a story turns out a little bit how you've pictured it. Because sometimes when you're writing, things change, right? Like you can start even from like, your lead down to your conclusion, just like it's somewhere in the middle of the story, you can sort of take a turn that you didn't anticipate. So I always feel pretty satisfied when either like I follow a story kind of to the end that I wanted it to have, or even if it does change dramatically, that I still feel really proud of the work. I think when I step away from a story and if it didn't feel rushed, if I gave it the time it deserved, then I feel like I'm not cheating myself.
Yeah.
But no, I should get some kind of motto. It's a good idea.
My mentor, John Hartophilus, he's actually like the founder of Gen Z Hoops. So whenever I tell him like, oh yeah, I got like a few interviews with like all these guests and stuff like that. I posted the interviews on YouTube, Instagram, like etc. We always say that's what winning looks like. So he's like, Ash,
That's a
did
good
you win
one.
today? So that's like our thing, kind of like motivates us to like kind of move on to the next thing and have that like short-term memory that you were talking about earlier.
Oh yeah. I like that because that could apply to a lot of stuff. Like, did you win today? Could Doesn't necessarily have to be these big swings all the time.
Oh yeah, of
Some
course.
days it could just be like getting up and like getting outside or like,
Yeah.
making a couple calls or like responding to a few emails or something to sort of push things forward. I like that.
He always says like you gotta win short term to win long term as well. So I kind of like pushes me and motivates me as well.
That's smart.
Yeah, most definitely. So aside from basketball, you actually have done other campaigns in other sports. So when I was doing my research, I actually came across that you worked on the Nike Times Together campaign for the 2023 Women's World Cup. Can you talk a little bit about the work that you did for this campaign?
Yeah, so I do copywriting as well on the side. I will say that's kind of how I balance out being able to be a full-time freelance basketball writer because obviously, as you know, the seasons don't. My work kind of isn't determined on the season, but sometimes outlets can't necessarily like pay for your work in the summer because there's not that much going on. So copywriting is a way I've figured out how to balance that out, and it offers a different style of writing. So that campaign that you mentioned for the Women's World Cup was pretty cool. Nike was relaunching their football verticals for the Women's World Cup. So they wanted brand new kind of tone of voice, new messaging to relaunch it. And they were really interested in telling the stories of their athletes. So some of it was team focused, but the tricky thing is like Nike wasn't the sponsor of every single team, obviously, in the World Cup. So they
Right.
wanted it to be more athlete focused. So there was a lot of research that went into that. And I do really that's like one thing I like about any kind of writing, whether it's like copywriting or, long form feature writing. I love the research part. I love just like going down research rabbit holes and really trying to inform myself as best I can about a subject.
Right.
And so that was so much research into their athletes down to like lurking their social media, but also like going back to try and read almost every article that had ever been written about them. And of course, like for the women soccer players, a lot of them had common themes that like, they played on boys teams until they were maybe going to college or like in their teens, just because when girls teams weren't where they lived, unfortunately, as competitive or like taken as seriously. So it was cool to find I mean, that's depressing, but it was like cool to kind of find those commonalities. But yeah, so we ended up writing sort of like long form threads that they
Right.
would post across social with like fun facts, and it was more narrative driven, so everything felt a lot like a story as you were reading it rather than just kind of like a she shoots, she scores kind
Right.
of post. Um, the hardest thing about that, I will say, is because the Together team was in Australia for the game, and I was working Australian hours in Toronto. So
Wow.
I was working for a couple of weeks from
Insane.
like 11 at night to 5 a.m., just like sitting alone at my computer because some of the stuff we were posting had to be reactionary to the games that were happening as they were happening. Like they would be triggered by a goal or a save, something like that, especially if their athletes were setting records, in real time. Nike really wanted to capture that. So That was tough. That was like, it felt like a very lonely 2 weeks in August where I was like, didn't see my friends and family and was just like sleeping through the day like a weird troll. But otherwise, that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, most definitely. It's a shame that our Team USA couldn't bring home the gold in that World Cup, bring home the championship. But I'm optimistic that Team USA this year for the the Paris Olympics can bring home that gold and put us back on top. I
They're
do.
almost like they're that was very surprising, that outcome. Because like Team USA is like the juggernaut of
Yeah.
women's soccer. They do have a rivalry, I will say, with Team Canada, but Team Canada is now in a real like a rebuilding sort of situation.
Not Team Canada men's basketball though. I know
Yeah.
I was gonna get
Yeah.
into that. I was gonna get into that a little later, but though that roster, oh my gosh, it's sometimes way better than like the FIBA World Cup teams that Team USA brings out here,
Oh
especially last
yeah.
year's. I could
Yeah.
tell.
I think it's funny. I know people say this is a joke, but I think there's some truth to it. It's like as soon as Team Canada kind of won in the qualifiers, it was like Team USA. Like that's when LeBron and like all these like superstars were like committing to Paris. It's like, oh, wait a second, like we can't get beat by these guys. Cause it's exciting as a Canadian to have such a good team to root for with like legitimate, NBA superstars. I think that's certainly like a testament to growth in basketball in Canada, but it also just feels cool as like a country that's been an underdog in basketball for so long.
Oh yeah, of course. Like, who would you say your favorite Canadian basketball player is?
Probably Shea Gilgeous-Alexander.
Yeah,
I really like Nikhil Alexander Walker too. Yeah, they're cousins, which certainly helps. But I also will say the thing that I didn't ever expect happening was watching that Team Canada made me change my mind on Dylan Brooks. I started rooting for Dylan Brooks, who before I was just like, this guy's a villain and I can't get behind him. But now I'm like, no, I respect what he did.
I feel like there's those players on like every team in the NBA. Like you need a guy like that, a guy who's gonna like get under like the other team's skin, a guy who's gonna like put himself out there, kind of like take all the hate, and then like it kind of gives you like a some sort of like motivating factor to like, yeah, let's get behind him and let's go like get this win at the end of the day.
No, totally.
I do think he takes it a little too far though when he like, when he like stares at the other team,
Yes.
like the warm-ups, like the death stare. Like you
Yes.
put in like 2K, I remember. And like if you play as the Rockets, you have him standing there like that. I think it's the funniest thing. But
That's hilarious.
aside from the Paris Olympics, another big event this summer, NBA Summer League. So this summer at NBA Summer League, you're gearing up for your fourth consecutive appearance to be an instructor at Sports Business Classroom. What are your favorite aspects of being an instructor at SBC?
I mean, selfishly, it's being at Summer League, which is like I've loved Summer League as like if you're like a basketball junkie or just like love watching like kind of frenetic, very strange basketball, um, it's sort of heaven,
Yep.
Also, I will say just in terms of like if you love sighting people and never really knowing who you're gonna run into, it's so
Yep.
cool. Like, yeah, like you're like, oh, like there's Rasheed Wallace, or like there's like once I almost fell into LeBron James because like a Japanese
No
camera
way.
crew like was pushing by me, and I was like, oh, that's LeBron. Um, I've like saw Rui Hachimura DJ one night, like you just like it's very it makes the NBA, which is already small, feel even smaller, which is cool.
Right.
But uh, and the basketball is fun to watch too. But I think teaching is really cool for some of the things we've touched on. I was brought into SBC first as more of just like an instructor role. I taught a couple classes in my first 2 years on storytelling and on writing. But like I'm always struck by the groups that they get together at SBC, how committed they are. Like sometimes they make me feel a little bit intimidated because what we were talking about before of like not necessarily needing to know from the get-go that like you want to be in sports media or like work in sports. A lot of these, and I will say like they're all ages, so it's not just students that are just out of college. Some of them are trying for a second career. We've had former NBA players that have come through the program, which has been really
Wow.
cool too. But there's just such a drive and like a really clear interest in who they are and what they want to do and like where they see themselves. So I'm always just like very impressed by the confidence and kind of cadence that a lot of the students have, but also how open they are to learning. And like, nobody's too cool, you know, everybody is there for the same reason, because they want to meet people and network and, you know, eventually get a job with, whether it's like with a team on like the salary cap side of things, or in a front office, or, you know, for the stream that I teach, media and broadcast, you know, in sports media. So it's very invigorating, I would say, for me too. Like I leave that, and well, I always leave like feeling kind of like a dried out husk of myself being in Vegas for so long. I leave feeling very mentally refreshed and reinvigorated just about the work that I'm doing too.
Yeah, most definitely. So I've been I've been meaning to ask you this. Like you've been featured on all these different platforms and like have all these different pieces of writing. If you had to pick one piece of writing over the course of your whole career that had to be your favorite, which would you say it is?
Geez, Ashton, these questions are so hard hitting.
I'm sorry
It's
about that. I'm
tough.
sorry.
No, it's good. You're a great interviewer. I think probably because it was one at the time, kind of like it was like the big swing I'd made to pitch this place. I didn't know that they would accept it. I was just like, you know, I try and have these goals for myself of like it, like as we were talking about earlier, kind of like always expanding my bylines. I have these goals of like, this is my aspirational place I want to write for. And this was one. So it was for the New York Times Magazine. And I love the dunk contest.
Right.
Very selfishly, I will defend it to my last breath. Even bad dunk contests, I love. Like, I just see the value in them. And in a different way, I think, than a lot of people do. Like, yes, they're entertaining, but I always think there's something very brave and I don't know, kind of interesting about like making yourself so vulnerable as an NBA player in front of this huge crowd, and like knowing you can mess up or get trolled or just like
Jericho
look like an
Sims that
idiot.
one year.
Yes. Or like I think of like when John Collins like smashed the airplane. Like there's been
Oh
so many
yeah.
goofy ones, you know, but like I see the value in those too. But I pitched a story just of like, you know, the dunk contest is actually good was basically kind of the story. And I wrote it for the Screenland column in the New York Times Magazine. And like one, the editing process, like the fact checking process with the New York Times, obviously, but I hadn't gone through something that rigorous yet of just having to like, I think I had something in there about like a 360, or it was like a 180. And the fact checker looked and it was like, oh, he didn't quite make it all the way to 180. Just like watching film, like,
Right.
okay, I guess we can't say that. But I loved that just because, again, it was like something I am obsessed with and love. And it was for a place that I'd always wanted to write for. And the other cool thing was it came out during All-Star weekend. So I was in Salt Lake City for All-Star. And that morning I went out with a friend of mine to try and find the newspaper, which was harder than you would think. But we found the newspaper, found the magazine just at like a CVS or something. But all the clerks were so excited when my friend Jerome was like, she's in there. She wrote something in there. But it was cool to like have that at All-Star. And I like,
That's cool.
it was pretty corny, but like I took it to the game that night.
So since you said like your favorite event is the dunk contest, which dunk contest like in the history is like your favorite?
Probably Vince Carter's, I think. Yeah, the 2000.
Oh, the It's Over one where he
Yeah. I mean, one, it was such a good dunk contest. Like I don't think any dunks that night were quote bad.
Right.
And because he just like set an entirely new precedent of like
of
what it was you could do. And like there was like the kind of the campiness and the showmanship. And then like learning more about talking to Vince since and like learning more about that dunk contest, knowing that like he almost didn't make it to the game because like he couldn't get a ride over the bridge to Oakland. So he was late. He scrapped everything he had practiced. Like going in, he was like, no, these like the dunks I practiced like weren't going to be good enough. So a lot of that stuff he was just doing on the fly. So like when you think about those things too, you're just like, okay, this is like the most athletic thing somebody can do. And also isn't totally out of their mind nervous about it. So probably that one.
I had to go like a little more my time, the Zach LaVine, Aaron Gordon one
in Toronto.
Yeah, in 2016.
That was great.
Crazy how dunking always goes back to Toronto in some way. You had Vince Carter, he won it. You had Terrence Ross, he won it one year. That guy could fly. Oh my God.
Yeah.
And then the greatest dunk. I feel like that was the greatest dunk contest of all time. The one in Toronto with 2016, Zach LaVine, Aaron Gordon, and LaVine jumping from like the free throw line between the legs, windmilling, caught a lob even for Andre Miller. Thought that was amazing. Do you
That
think
one was
Aaron Gordon got
really
robbed?
good. I do, because I was also the second dunk contest that comes to mind was I was when I was in Chicago, and he dunked over Taco Fall. Not just because he did
Oh,
that,
when
but
Derrick Jones Jr. won it?
yeah, because Derrick Jones Jr. won, and I like Dwayne Wade was like there was something going on with the judges. Like they all seemed surprised that he didn't win, and when Derrick Jones Jr. when the person you're trying to beat is surprised that they won, I
Yeah,
feel like that's a pretty good sign. And I was in the post game press conference when Aaron Gordon was like basically like I'm gonna retire,
he's
and
not doing
I
this
think he
again.
was trying to play it cool, but there was like I don't know, there was something very he wasn't happy, like he was upset.
Oh, yeah, of
So
course. I
yes, I
feel
think
like
he was robbed.
a lot of people say that Dwayne Wade kind of rigged it because Derrick Jones like is a Heat player, was
Yeah.
on the Heat at the time, they were teammates. And then but then Aaron Gordon like dropped that Dwayne Wade diss track. He's like
Oh
kind of like
yeah.
roasting
I
him.
mean, he took it a little far,
That
I'll
was funny
admit.
though.
Yeah, but
I
that's why
enjoyed
I
that.
think he was like he was hurt, like I
Yeah, of course.
yeah, but I think he should have, three dunk contests in a row when you're like almost there. I feel like he should have won.
I feel like I don't even count the 2017 one. He said like that one that he did, you remember with like the hoverboard and all that stuff and how it,
Yes.
like
Yeah,
dropped the
yeah.
ball. He said like he didn't even like plan any of that stuff. That was a train wreck, I remember. I think Derrick Jones was in that one too, but I'm
He
glad
was. Yeah, he
Glenn
was.
Robinson won it, I think,
Yeah, I
from
think
the
so.
Pacers at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I w- I don't really count that dunk contest though, if I'm being honest, but that's besides the point. So moving on to our next point. I know we talked about like you giving like advice to like young writers looking to pursue a career in journalism, but like for someone who doesn't know about anything about the industry, like let's scratch like all the sports like knowledge that like someone may know. What advice do you have for like those people out there who are trying to like get into the industry?
Ooh, I think it's like goes back to what I said before, to not feel like you're too late, or maybe you're like coming at it from a different way. Like there's no right way, especially now, like there's no right way, I think, to get into sports media, like in any capacity. It is still a lot about people you meet and kind of like making yourself familiar, um, to the people who you want to either work alongside one day or who could really help you get there. I think reaching out, it never hurts to reach out to people who's like, whether you're a writer and you want to, you want to be a sports writer, it helps to reach out to writers that you like. If you want to be a broadcaster, same thing goes there. I think there can be some fear of like, well, maybe like they won't write. The worst thing that happens is they're not going to write back. No one's ever going to respond and be like, how dare you reach out to
Right.
me? And for the most part, I would say people are happy. Like I'm always happy when people reach out to me with questions, and want advice. Sometimes I feel like I'm not in a position to give it, but it's like, no, I'm farther along than I was. And I think that's it. It's like no one, even these people that you think have like made it
Right.
or like the top of the industry, in their minds, they're also still striving, right? They're also still trying to get somewhere. So it helps to keep that in mind too. But just like, don't be nervous, reach out to people if that you think can help you, you know, don't just be, I don't mean that in like a self-serving way, because I think there can be like a genuine interest of wanting to learn, um, and like picking people's brains. And then I say it would also help to like be around the sport if you can. So if you live in a market where there is an NBA or WNBA team, to reach out to team PR staff, and just say who you are, what you're trying to do. Like, for yourself, you're like a young broadcaster. Like, could you get credentialed to a game? Because a lot of times, if it's like a middle of the season, maybe don't do it in the playoffs, but if it's like the middle of the season or something, I'm sure they'd be happy to fulfill that. And the best thing about that is like getting there ahead of time
Right.
and introducing yourself to people, and meeting people. I would say as a writer, it can be a really lonely game because you're just working by yourself all the time. Like my most social aspect during the season is going to Raptors games and like catching up with people pregame, and that's also when I've met some of the people who, I met Doris Burke that way. Like it's like you meet people you would never otherwise meet. So it can be really valuable for that too. But I think just like trying to get around the game is really helpful.
Wow, most definitely. So as we stated before, everyone has like kind of like a beginning to their story, like how they got into it. And of course, everyone has like different future aspirations. So what I'm asking you, what are your future aspirations for your career moving forward?
Well, I'm working on a book right now, that was something that aspirationally I did always want to do. To be honest with you, I didn't think it would necessarily be about basketball, but it's going to be, and that's fine. It'll be essays, about basketball and the culture around it, and sort of spliced with like personal essays and stories too. So I think for that, I have to finish that first, and then after that, it will probably be to write another book. I think I have to. This season was so busy for me; it went by so quickly that I didn't do that thing I mentioned before of like trying to target sort of like an aspirational place to write for. I have a few places in mind. So I think, yeah, to get back out once the book is done, to start pitching again a lot more broadly. But I don't know, like I kind of waffled, to be totally honest with you, about the idea of trying to work full-time staff somewhere, just because I've also like, I have colleagues in the industry who did, and then were laid off because those places shut down. So it doesn't necessarily seem like the safer bet, right? And I do enjoy sort of the freedom that I have. So I think for me, it's just taking my own advice, getting better about, reaching out to the connections that I have, be them agents, team people, and trying to write bigger stories. I've written a few investigative kind of pieces in my career, and I really enjoyed them. So probably something like that. I think at this point, my goals feel more individual. They're less broad. They're more specific of like, I want to do like something like this exactly. I don't know if that's helpful. I hope that's like a specific enough answer.
That was a great answer. So thank you so much today for coming on the show, Katie. Giving me this opportunity. I wish you the best of luck moving forward. And I'm really looking forward to learning from you this summer at SBC.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Gen Z Hoops. Make sure to follow, like, and subscribe on Instagram, LinkedIn, and all major social media platforms at Gen Z Hoops. You can tune in and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and every other podcast platform on the planet. Get ready for the next episode.